There are three forms of writing in the New Testament: Gospels, letters, and the apocalyptic or prophetic. Certainly this is the order most are familiar with in their Bibles, which generally follow a narrative timeline. However, in terms of composition and when these works were written, it is generally accepted that the letters appeared first. Scholars mostly agree that Paul began his preaching to the Gentiles no later than 46 AD, of which he immediately made Gentile disciples. However, these were not the earliest Gentile converts. Acts also attests to at least 2 Gentile conversions that occurred well before this period: the Ethiopian eunuch by Philip, dated to 31 AD, and Cornelius and his household by Peter, dated to 37 AD. It is immediately after this story, and well before 40 AD, that it is established that the Gentiles are receiving repentance. In fact, this movement began to grow quickly with the established Church of Antioch, where a great number of Greeks believed around 42 AD. It is obvious then that these early converts were not Jews, therefore they must have been Gentiles. What is commonly assumed, however, is that these converts had no relation to the Hebrews, that in their ancestry they were a foreign and pagan people, and it is here that we unravel a mystery. The earliest letter was probably James, dated to no earlier than 46 AD, and most likely after. This James is assumed to be the brother of Jesus and the leader of the Jerusalem church. Most likely, this letter came after Paul's ministry to the Gentiles began. However, we will soon see that this is irrelevant. No matter the timing of Paul's ministry, James was certainly aware of the conversion of Cornelius and his household, and Peter's associated vision more than a decade earlier, along with many Greeks that believed in Antioch. And yet we fail to appreciate the address to whom his letter concerns, which is only the 12 tribes. It is obvious then that James is writing to Jews in his letter, but Jews only composed 2 of these 12 tribes. Most Bible believers do not even know the story of the 10 tribes, which, as we will see, is so fundamental to the message of the New Testament, so allow me to present a quick primer. Christianity's story does not begin with Jesus and the New Testament. It begins with Moses, or people who identified themselves as descendants of the patriarchs. Some people might quibble and say, no, it begins further back than that, but the story was not penned by these patriarchs. Nevertheless, the story of these descendants picks up with Abraham. It is to him and his offspring that there is a promise given by Yahweh, in which the seal of this promise is the circumcision. Just because Yahweh made the promise to Abraham does not guarantee that all of his descendants will inherit the promise. As Paul even says, not all Israel is Israel. In fact, the story makes clear that his firstborn son, Ishmael, is not a recipient. In fact, Abraham had a total of 8 sons, and only through one of them were the promises given, and that was Isaac. Now Isaac had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, and only Jacob was heir to the promise. Esau had his own descendants, but to them the promises were not made. In fact, it is promised to Jacob that Esau's descendants will serve Jacob's. Now Jacob had 13 children, one of which was a daughter, and thus not an heir to the promise. Instead, the promises extended exclusively to the Hebrew descendants, and these were the descendants of Jacob's 12 sons, fathers of what is known as the 12 tribes of Israel. It is worth mentioning that Levites were not considered a tribe, in that they had no land inheritance in the promised land of Israel. Instead, they were a priestly class from whom Moses and his brother Aaron descended. In their stead, the tribe of Joseph was split into 2 based on his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. It is the progeny of these 12 patriarchs in the priestly lineage of Levi which constitute the Hebrew peoples collectively called the 12 tribes. And it was prophesied that Ephraim would become a multitude of nations, a rough translation that truly means composed of many nations. From Moses onward, the commonwealth of Israel, the name derived from Jacob's name change, were ruled by judges, and afterward they were ruled for 3 generations by kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, as the unified kingdom of Israel. After Solomon died, the kingdom split into 2, with 10 tribes composing the kingdom of Israel mostly in the north, and 2 tribes composing the kingdom of Judah relatively to the south. Both kingdoms were short-lived, but the northern kingdom of Israel was first destroyed at the hands of Assyria. When they were exiled, these 10 tribes effectively became lost to history. No non-biblical source references any member of these tribes, and no one, until the New Testament, traced their ancestry to these tribes. These were a people who were forgotten and who had forgotten themselves. Jeremiah had prophesied that Israel would be divorced from their covenant with Yahweh due to their prodigal ways, and Yahweh declared in Hosea that they are not my people. The kingdom of Judah lasted a little while longer, but Babylon eventually destroyed their temple and exiled their people. However, a remnant remained faithful to their covenant with Yahweh, and eventually were granted a right to return to the land and rebuild the temple by the Persians, not having suffered the same fate as their northern tribe brethren. But without a kingdom, we need a better word to refer to these two groups of Hebrew people. And this is where the biblical reference to the house of Israel for the 10 lost tribes and the house of Judah for the 2 faithful tribes becomes important. Now, back to our story. Over a decade after converting the Gentile Ethiopian eunuch and Cornelius, the church at Antioch, as well as Paul's ministry to the Gentiles having begun with immediate success, it is reasonable to suggest that the pagans are becoming a burgeoning faction of Christian converts. After all, it is the Jews who continued to oppose the message of Jesus and of Paul. However, James seems to have ignored this group of people when he writes his earliest letter. The letter is simply addressed to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, which is clearly a reference specifically to the Hebrew people. The problem, however, isn't that James ignored this sect of allegedly pagan Christians. The problem is that he wrote to an entire group that did not exist. You see, the only tribes of the Hebrew people that anyone is familiar with or are aware of their ancestry are the 2 tribes: Judah, from whom descended Jesus and the Judahites, and Benjamin, from whom descended Paul and the Benjamites. And this raises the question, why is James writing a letter to the 10 tribes when no one, including themselves, knows who they are? Well, the obvious answer is what makes this so interesting. Aside from the Jews, James is writing a letter to people who believed themselves to be lost Israelites. This then raises the question, was James really ignoring the pagans that Philip, Peter, or Paul converted? Or did the pagans who converted believe themselves to be descendants of the lost Israelites of the 10 tribes? Now, I know that such an argument seems absurd. Surely some of these people would actually know their family lineage, and they would have disagreements among their fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, and sons-in-law and fathers-in-law, who would argue that there is no way we are descended from these 10 tribes because we know that our ancestors were not Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. These people wouldn't have been alone. In fact, there were at least 3 Greeks who challenged this gospel message that Paul was preaching: Alexander, Hymenaeus, and Philetus. And at the same time this question of genealogies was taking place, Paul admits all those in Asia turned away from him, including Phygellus and Hermogenes. It makes sense then that the topic of ancestry and genealogical descent was very divisive among the Gentiles. So divisive, in fact, that Paul on 2 separate occasions instructs Timothy and Titus to shut down these discussions, for they will cause all kinds of questions. As noted earlier, there is no non-biblical record of an existing lineage of the 10 tribes. In fact, Josephus even tells us that they are still beyond the Euphrates, and Origen even attests that the Romans can only account for 2 tribes in his letter to Africanus. Therefore, the only way the typical Gentile would have learned of a possible Israelite heritage would have been if those who knew the history had told them. The only ones who knew this history were the Jews. Suffice it to say that certain Jews were teaching them this lesson, perhaps Jews who made it their mission to preach amongst the Gentiles. And now we can understand why James was written to the 12 tribes of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written specifically for those whose forefathers were Hebrews, and Peter was written to the exiles in the dispersion. Bear in mind that Romans are not exiles when they are in Rome. Taken together, that is over 11% of the New Testament and 15% of the letters written to no one else besides Jews and people who believed themselves to be descendants of the 10 tribes of the house of Israel, in contrast to being truly pagan Gentiles. But to strengthen this statement, Peter also confirms that Paul wrote to the same people that he did. Are you not convinced yet? Then keep this in mind. If James was written at an even later date, the pagans would have certainly constituted the majority of Christians. We only need to look at the early church of Origen, Augustine, Clement, or even Polycarp, which makes it much more reasonable that James was not ignoring these people. Rather, he was writing to these pagans who considered themselves to be Israelites and confirming that belief. But what would be the purpose of going through the trouble of convincing them of their Hebrew ancestry? Well, this has to do with the nature of the covenant. As Paul mentions in Galatians, no one annuls a covenant once it has been ratified. Among the earliest letters are those to the Thessalonians, and in these letters there is a strong focus on the wrath of God that has already begun arriving. But what do these people have to fear? They are citizens with full rights in the greatest empire the world has ever known. There is simply no contemporary match which stands a chance at getting past the Roman soldiers to harm the citizenry. Yet Paul affirmed over and over again that wrath was imminent, and faith in Christ is what spares them, contrary to the common notion that salvation has to do with deliverance from immorality. Simply put, the argument Paul is making to the Thessalonians is not one of citizenship, but of judgment because of who they are. Yet pagans did not have these doctrines of judgment, nor did they have a reason to fear Yahweh. Yahweh isn't their deity and is practically foreign to them. It was necessary that Paul convinced them that this isn't the case and that they belong to Yahweh, which is only by being a descendant of the family that, among all the families of the earth, only them had Yahweh chosen, and so Yahweh will punish them for their iniquities, as Amos says. You see, wrath was coming to them by dint of birth. The Jews who had converted the early pagans had to convince them that the Mosaic law, which carried with it the law of blessings and curses, was relevant to them. Only then could they warrant wrath from Yahweh, because sin is only counted where there is the law. And the law brings wrath, but when there is no law, there is no transgression, as Paul says in Romans. And since only the 12 tribes had been chosen to receive this law, it was necessary to convince them that they were descendants of this group. It is certain that these Gentiles with reason to fear Yahweh were not Judahites or Benjamites or Levites, because those tribes were still around. Therefore, by process of elimination, they had to be Hebrews of a different lineage. They had to be descended from these 10 lost tribes. It is in this context that we can now understand the other teachings in Paul's letters. For instance, God sent forth His Son, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. Again, only Israel had this law and reason to fear for disobedience. Salvation wasn't about immorality, it was about being rescued from Yahweh's wrath. It really is that simple. The Greeks, so steeped in reason, logic, and Western philosophy, began to understand this pitch, which is why Paul and Peter had to take great strides to shut down conversations that began to derail the mission, and repeatedly swear that they are not lying or following cleverly devised myths. It can also be seen that as time went on, the authors began to distinguish their disciples apart from the Gentiles. As the church began to believe about themselves what the Jews taught them, they would be distinguished from Gentiles in the same way Jews were distinguished. Paul in Ephesians would go on to call them Gentiles in the flesh, the uncircumcision, as opposed to just Gentiles. When Paul makes clear the mystery that the Gentiles are fellow heirs and members of the same body and partakers of the same promise, he is not saying that pagan Gentiles have been brought into the covenant. Remember that no one annuls a covenant once it has been ratified. Instead, the revelation is that these people who believe in Jesus are able to do so because they are Abraham's seed and therefore are heirs according to the promise. This conclusion may also seem absurd, and that's because it is. A pagan believing in Jesus at this time was comparable to a Christian becoming a Muslim or a Hindu today. It would take almost a miracle to convert a skeptic. Thus, the ability to be able to believe was sold as proof that being an Israelite is in your DNA with those famous words, "If you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." This isn't about spiritual descendants, it is about being descended from Abraham's 12 great-grandsons. To conclude this thought, Paul tells the Philippians, if anyone thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, that is to say his lineage, that Paul has more. It would be nonsense for a pagan to believe his lineage is worth anything if he thinks he is just a spiritual child of Abraham. Instead, these converts didn't believe this covenant to be foreign to them. Their confidence rested on the belief that they are Israelites by ancestry, and thus part of this family, and beholden to this covenant, and a beneficiary of the promises. Finally, the last linchpin holding this whole myth together can now be diffused, and that is Romans. It is often assumed that Paul is writing to pagans, merely because he is writing to a people living in Rome. Yet Paul states several times, Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh, for the promise was to Abraham and his offspring, and Abraham, the father of us all. To bolster this point, he also explains that the Gentiles show that the law is written on their hearts, a direct reference to Jeremiah 31, in which Yahweh declares he is going to establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. The sign of this new covenant, like circumcision for the old, would be that he is going to write this law on their hearts. To be of the house of Israel or the house of Judah is to be a Hebrew and not truly pagan. These are not people who believed themselves to be genuinely pagan. Instead, they believed themselves to be descended from Abraham. It is here that Paul references Hosea 2:23, saying that those who were not my people, I will call my people. And just like all prophecies referenced from the Old Testament, this is only about Israel and not pagans. And this is why it is so important to know the history of the Hebrew people to make sense of what Paul and the early church were teaching. The chapters of Romans 9 through 11 about being grafted in is not about pagans, but about Israelites. They were once cut off, having been brought back in. He even goes so far as to call them an olive shoot, an Old Testament metaphor for unified Israel as an olive tree, in which the same Jeremiah mentioned earlier, who warns of Israel's divorce from the covenant, prophesies that their branches will be broken off. Finally, we can take an honest look at some of the harder sayings of Jesus in the Gospels. For instance, don't go to the Gentiles, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Find out who is worthy, suggesting that the disciples are to trek among the Gentiles to pick out the Israelites. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus renders himself completely irrelevant to pagans. And you, Canaanite woman, are a dog. This is the attitude of the Jews towards the pagans. And the God of Israel has redeemed his people. This people was well known to be the Hebrews. Most Christians do not even understand the reference of fishers of men. This is blatantly lifted from Jeremiah 16, which is about the restoration of Israel's kingdom of all 12 tribes, with knowledge that the Israelites would be found among the Gentiles, and with no hint that the pagans would be joining the covenant. Yahweh declares that he will send out many fishers who will fish out the lost Israelites who are lost among the Gentiles. They are not fishing out pagan Gentiles. The obviousness of this reference in the gospel story is almost comical. Now get ready, because it is here that we are about to square this circle. It is reasonable to ask that if the lost tribes are being revealed and the apostles wrote to them, do we have any narrative proof, perhaps in the Gospels or Acts, that their revelation is being foreshadowed? Luke records the story of Anna, prophetess of the tribe of Asher, a northern kingdom tribe. As stated earlier, there are no non-biblical sources for people with this lineage, especially among Greeks and Romans, but here we have one with a family with a known pedigree. Anna's appearance and prophesying are a reference to Joel 2:28, "Your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions," which Peter referenced during Pentecost in Acts, and, as expected, is a reference specifically to the people descended from the 12 tribes. As an aside, this story creates its own problems for dispensational eschatology, because her appearance implies the revelation of the lost tribes, which must happen before the end of the age. Since these tribes are apparently lost again, it must mean either the story is fake or the end already happened. Bear in mind that Josephus wrote just after the New Testament narrative, and he attests, as does Origen, that the 10 tribes are still lost. Now, it might be objected that this story is anecdotal, that one example does not prove the whole, but have a little more patience because this proof is about to get a lot stronger. Just before the introduction of Anna from the tribe of Asher, we are told of a man named Simeon, who is described as devout in the same manner as Cornelius. Now, the story of Simeon seems strangely out of place because the Holy Spirit has already come upon him while Jesus was still an infant, over 30 years before the noteworthy Pentecost in which the Spirit came upon the believers gathered in Jerusalem. Despite this, the Spirit had given him a revelation, which some may suggest is a dream or a vision, that he would see the Lord's Christ before he died. But what is most curious is that he was awaiting the consolation of Israel, and not a covenant between Yahweh and pagans. The fact that Simeon's story seems out of place in this timeline helps us to understand the early teaching that occurs during Pentecost by Peter. In the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 5, we are told that Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven, are gathered in Jerusalem. And then in verse 11, it further explains that this is both Jews and proselytes. And then in verse 22, Peter changes his address from Jews and proselytes to men of Israel. But before going further, we need to understand Luke's use of the word devout. Among the people called devout in Luke's writings are Simeon, who prophesied over Jesus, Ananias, who aided Paul in his conversion, Cornelius, who saw a vision, and most interestingly, the Jewish proselytes present at Pentecost. By definition, a Jewish proselyte is not ethnically Jewish, and at this time, the word Christian had not yet been placed as a moniker for this budding religion. Hence the reason Luke would first call them devout Jews and then Jewish proselytes, and Peter would first call them men of Judea and dwellers in Jerusalem, and then go on to call these people, in addition to the ethnic Jews, as men of Israel. He only does so after quoting that famous passage from Joel, and this is truly the first time Peter makes the connection that these people belong to the house of Israel, as he calls them. You see, Luke was dropping hints throughout this story as to who the identity of these proselyte believers were. A notable example is his hint that these devout men are a multitude from every nation under heaven. A person who understands the Hebrew story would immediately recall the Israelite tribe of Ephraim, prophesied to become a multitude of nations. He is identifying them as Israelites. To bring us back to the beginning, long before the Ethiopian eunuch, Cornelius in his house, the church at Antioch, or Paul's conversion, let alone his ministry, this multitude of proselytes, who also called themselves Jews, and we will come back to this important point at the end, were not Jews at all. Instead, they were the first Gentile converts, and they happened to be Israelites. We can now understand why Simeon was looking for Israel's consolation, the relief from slumming with the Gentiles, and not a covenant involving pagans. You see, James was not writing to a group that didn't exist, and he was not ignoring the pagan Christians. Pagan Christians simply didn't exist. To be a Christian was to be a Hebrew, either a Jew or an Israelite. If you were Christ's, then you were Abraham's seed and an heir, according to the promise. James simply confirmed this belief that was taught to them at Pentecost. The timeline that began this video is irrelevant once you understand this story. What looked to be a handful of Gentile conversions simply made it seem plausible that James didn't think it necessary to write to them. However, Gentiles were a part of Christianity since its inception, and not just a few, a multitude. You see, Luke was writing having already known the conclusion. Despite the narrative of Peter's vision at the conversion of Cornelius years later, Luke already had in mind what the reader was being taught, that they are descendants of the house of Israel and not truly pagans. Simply put, Luke was not hiding what he already knew to be the conclusion of this mission. It is now time to get particular with the Roman centurion named Cornelius. Now, many people have made the argument that Cornelius indeed was an Israelite. It was well known that Cornelius was a Gentile man devout to Yahweh and not to a pagan deity. In Acts 10:3, we see the words written, "He saw clearly a vision." Referring back again to Joel 2:28, it must be concluded that Cornelius was not a pagan Roman, but instead was a Gentile Israelite. Gentile in the flesh. In fact, he was one of these Jewish proselytes. The story isn't so much about Cornelius becoming a Gentile convert, as it is that Peter finally realized the same mystery of the Gentiles that Paul would go on to see. They are brethren in the flesh. They are family, physical descendants of Abraham and heirs of the promises along with the Jews. They were once called common, but have now been made clean. Understanding their ancestry, then, it becomes apparent why circumcision was such a hot topic. It wasn't a matter of faith, it was a matter of family. Now this is our last aside. It can't be stressed enough how detrimental this is to dispensationalist eschatology. Before, the only explicitly attested Israelite was Anna, and yet we lack any non-biblical source for a reference to people with this ancestry. However, in the year 33 AD, when this particular Pentecost occurred, hundreds, if not thousands, of Gentile believers would have identified themselves as Israelites. And if they were Israelites, so were their siblings, children, cousins, and their parents, in one manner or another. Thus, by the time Josephus was writing, there should have been thousands of them, and they should have been known to the rabbis and priests, including Josephus, and probably even Romans, including Origen. And yet they aren't. Again, either the end already came and went, or the story was a hoax. It is now that we can understand the parable of the prodigal son. The northern kingdom was the prodigal son who lived among pigs, a pejorative reference to pagans, just like the woman called a dog. And the southern kingdom was the faithful son. Despite the animosity that existed between these two houses of Israel and Judah, the father welcomed back his prodigal son, and the faithful Jews played the role of the jealous son, such that now both needed reconciliation, the ministry that was Paul's. Lastly, there are the most misunderstood passages of Revelation. But first bear in mind, that we, observers 2,000 years later, understand these converts were pagans, but they were persuaded that they were Israelites. It should be obvious now that Paul and the other apostles were lying. To be clear, if they weren't lying, then thousands of Israelite converts would have at least been known to the Jews, and notably Josephus and Origen, who tell us that they are still effectively lost and are lost to this day, as opposed to the Jews. Now we know this preaching started in synagogues. It's where Paul would start his preaching, and it is where ethnically non-Jewish Jewish proselytes would have been found. And though it is often alleged that the Jews in the synagogues persecuted the Christians and Paul, we have little evidence that these are more than narrative stories. Consider that the Jews even had an additional court where devout Gentile Jewish proselytes such as Cornelius, Simeon, Ananias, or the multitude during Pentecost could attend temple in Jerusalem, a late addition by Herod Agrippa that appears more than coincidental to the advent of a religion that would draw people to Jerusalem. The real story is that the Jews were opening their synagogues and their temple, for whatever reason, to proselytizing Gentiles. But, like today, when being mostly unfamiliar with the Israelite story, when a pagan Gentile became convinced that he's not really a pagan, but related to the Jews through Abraham, it's unlikely he understood the nuance of the story that the Jews and the Israelites were two separate houses of Hebrews, which became even more obscured when considering what Luke called the proselytes himself. Instead, these early converts, in chorus with the ethnic Jews, improperly began to call themselves Jews. And now we can address several interesting verses in Revelation. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Satan is not a proper name. Satan simply translates to adversary, and there is no doubt adversarial blood between pagans and Jews. Anyone familiar with the enmity between Greeks who honored Antiochus Epiphanes and Jews who honored Judas Maccabee could understand that believing Gentiles would have animosity toward unbelieving Jews for how they allegedly treated Paul. But understood properly, it is the gullible pagans who began to incorrectly refer to themselves as Jews when they believed themselves to be Israelite descendants, and are the ones being referenced who say that they are Jews but are a synagogue of adversaries. As Paul would preach to the Philippians, this synagogue of Yahweh Satan has been bowing to his feet ever since. And then there are a few other verses that are misunderstood here. Rise and measure the temple of God, but do not measure the court outside the temple, for that is given over to the Gentiles, which is also known as the court of the Gentiles erected by Herod Agrippa. In reality, the book of Revelation contains within it an esoteric message, which is what makes understanding the book so difficult. I'll let the reviewer speculate on who the privileged persons were that were privy to the true message, but the text here is quite simple to unpack. The Gentiles are not truly part of the temple of God. Lastly, if you think it just can't be that pagans have no shot of entering this new covenant, be reminded of who sits outside the New Jerusalem. Outside are the dogs. The irony that this book and the characters within it have been praised for so long for promoting universal love and equality while undergirded with racism, exclusivity, and duplicity is palpable. The book of Revelation and the entire Bible is anti-pagan. And when I was a Christian, I would have approved of this posture. However, if I saw this stuff happening to my own friends and family, I would understand that the person telling them they are something that they are not has nefarious motives. Don't waste your time trying to make any more sense of the Bible. It is not your holy book. If you wrestle with this lesson, I guarantee you'll be ensnared further into its grip. I know this because I was there too. Revelation is meant to be confusing. Don't waste your time on it. Let this be your last Bible study except when you deliver your brother and sister from its spell. But work quickly. We have 2 millennia of paganism to wrest from the depths of our collective unconscious, suppressed by the poison pill that we call Christianity. A common objection will no doubt stem from this teaching, and that is that the church persecuted Jews throughout the Middle Ages. This is true, but that isn't because the New Testament is anti-Semitic. Instead, the friction between Jews and the Western civilizations dates far back into antiquity, and the animosity between Catholic Europe and the Jews was merely the resurgence of this cycle once again. Now pinned to this wholly new religion that suppressed and replaced the European paganisms through violent means, while the Jews remained intractably separate. It is under these frictions that the Church developed a priestly caste which kept the scriptures from translation into other languages and out of the commoner's hands. The only gospel the Church members learned of were those on stained glass windows and homilies, and the only times they had been allowed to read scripture were for Mass, and this was only if they could read Latin. The priests picked the scripture and kept the commoner from reading it for themselves. Look at the fate of Tyndale to see what happened as he worked to translate the Bible into the common language. Eventually, we did get a Bible in our native tongues, and today it is mass-produced globally, even by Jewish-led companies. This is in stark contrast to 600 years ago. The consequence has been that the hostility between Jews and Christians of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox denomination has largely been pacified over the last century. Suffice it to say that the New Testament is not anti-Jew. It was the priestly class ignorantly pinning the ethnic animus shared by many peoples against one onto the flimsily crafted passion narrative of this Semitic myth that was anti-Jew, and sought to keep their religion that way.